to express a Russian view on the most exciting and dramatic topic, Russia-West relations after the end of the Cold War. And let me start with one preliminary remark. The Caucasus crisis of 2008 has resulted in the unprecedented flare-up in tensions between Russia and the West and raised a question of a new Cold War. Since Cold War is not so much a scientific wording, but rather a journalistic term, any confrontation can be labeled as Cold War. But this interpretation does not indicate any starting point from which the West-Russia tensions and hostilities can be measured and assessed. So we know the Cold War as a certain period in our recent past which lasted from the 40s till the 90s, and which had several distinguishing features. First, the main parameter of the Cold War was the bipolar structure of the international system. The world was divided between two camps, and the crux of this confrontation was the USSR, US military confrontation. Second, in practically any local original conflict, the East and the West took the opposite sides of the barricades. Third, the arms race unprecedented in its scale, cost, and intensity. Fourth, the East-West ideological confrontation directed at demonizing each other and ascribing to each other all manner of evil conspiracies and aggressive intentions. And the last and fifth feature, this combination of circumstances meant that all the classic conditions were in place for potentially unleashing a new world war. If we look at our relations today, they're completely different from the Cold War period. First, the main component of the Cold War system, bipolarity, is missing. The world is multipolar. Aside from the United States, Russia, European Union, China, they have emerged new power centers and regional actors. Russia and the West are not on the different sides of the barricades in regional conflicts. They cooperate in Afghanistan, trying to prevent the return of Taliban. They cooperate on Iranian nuclear program, on North Korea. As for the arms race, despite the increase in the US and Russian defense spending over recent years, there has been nothing even remotely resembling what went on during the Cold War. The end of the Cold War coincided with the collapse of the communist ideology, and the truly ideological divide has developed between North and South, between globalism and anti-globalism, between modernization and conservative values. And the last and fifth point is that even two most serious crises which happened after the end of the Cold War, the Yugoslav War of 1999 and the Caucasus crisis of 2008, did not create any risk of a new world war. Nonetheless, the last decade of mutual dissatisfaction and mistrust has deeply affected the Russia-West relations and created a risk of a new confrontation, whatever its name. Many people in the West are nostalgic about the 90s, and they ask themselves, why does it go wrong when everything was so fine in the 90s? In my view, the main problem in the Russia-West relations are rooted in the 90s. And let me address my second issue, why did it go wrong? Usually, all world wars ended with peace conferences that established new world order. Nothing was created after the end of the Cold War. Russia was too weak and was too involved in its domestic turmoil and post-communist evolution. And the West didn't see any need to change the existing system because it was the USSR and the Soviet pact that collapsed. Thus, the unique chance to create a new world order, adjusted to the post-bipolar realities and to identify a new agenda for Euro-Atlantic cooperation, was lost. In a way, the post-bipolar order was replaced by the United States. Savoring the euphoria of unexpectedly finding itself the world's sole superpower, the United States increasingly began to substitute the rule of superior power for the rule of international law, to replace legitimate UN Security Council decisions with their own decisions, and to ignore the prerogatives of the OSCE in favor of NATO action. I can tell you that within the last 15 years, the United States has placed sanctions on more than a half of the world population. And it is, and this sanction, paradoxically, worked only in one case in North Korea. And every year it issues, or it has issued, I don't know whether Obama is going to continue this tradition, but the United States every year issued the annual report card on every other country's behavior, though in the Russian eyes, the United States cannot be seen as a model to follow. Let me remind you about Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, secret prisons in Europe, and the most tragic expression of the US policy was, in my view, the military operation against Yugoslavia in 1991. And after carrying out just lawful and successful military operation in Afghanistan, the United States invaded Iraq and planned to go further by reformatting the entire Greater Middle East to fit its own economic, political, and military interests. It became involved in the post-Soviet era and exacerbated relations with Russia. The second fundamental reason is related to the question on who lost the Cold War. And this question is extremely important for Russia and for our relations with the West. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia was treated by the West very much the same way Japan and Germany were treated after the end of the Second World War. But for Russia was a winner of the Cold War. Even the USSR did not lose the Cold War. The USSR lost detente, which was enhanced by the emerging multipolarity and Gorbachev's new political thinking, because in the situation of detente, it was very difficult for the top leadership to justify the waste of huge resources diverted from nations' wealth creation to the Cold War missions. As for Russia, it was the main driving force for the dissolution of the USSR. And however strange it may seem today, Russia played the same role Croatia played in former Yugoslavia. But Russia, as I have already said, was treated as a loser. And let me give you one one quote, which is very telling per se. It is a quote from a very prominent British political scientist, Lawrence Friedman, who wrote, "There is now no particular reason to classify Russia as a great power. It cannot therefore expect the privilege, respect, and extra sensitivity to its interests normally accorded a great power." That was the substance of the West approach towards Russia in the 90s. The Yeltsin leadership sincerely believed in Russia's rapid integration into the West and accepted the model of this relationship offered by the United States and NATO. And Russian liberals understood, even in the 90s, that when Russia became stronger, the pendulum would go to the opposite direction. And this happened. Of all mistakes of the West with regard to Russia, I think NATO's expansion was the biggest mistake. And the problem is that NATO is neither a new security institution and no 100% military alliance. It's something in between. Well, in Russian we have a saying, one cannot be a little bit pregnant, either or. And if NATO had started its internal reforms before the enlargement strategy took place, Russian critical position would have never developed. So we don't understand what NATO is. It's half man and half woman. Putin's Munich speech was a kind of, can be seen as a kind of watershed in the Russia-West relations. It was taken as a manifestation of anti-Western sentiments, but it was a message. I'm not speaking about his tone, because in foreign policy, the tone and the form matter. But in its substance, it was a message to the West, it was an appeal to the West to reconsider the model which was established in the 90s. Next, not even mistake, it happened. Communism was defeated in all post-communist states, not by democracy, but by nationalism, except one country, Russia. However strange it may seem today, Russia was the only country where communism was defeated by revolutionary liberals, because Russian nationalists were in favor of the Soviet Empire. So there was a very short period in our recent history when nobody could accuse us of new imperial ambitions. But very soon, nationalism in the neighboring states has become the main driving force in the formation of the statehood of newly independent states. And very quickly it has acquired an anti-Russian bias, fueling similar sentiments in Russia. And the West here made a terrible mistake. When the problem of the Soviet nuclear legacy was resolved, it started to look at the CIS as a kind of a new Russian empire, and it started to encourage disintegrationist trends in the CIS space. And newly independent states of the CIS area got the message: the worse with Russia, the better with the West. And at the end of the day, it fueled Russia's suspicions about the real goals of the United States, of NATO, and even European Union in the post-Soviet space. You know that Russia's reaction to the Eastern Partnership Initiative was very negative. And the last reason, the East-West confrontation stopped to exist in the international relations, but it shifted to the domestic level of those subjects of the international system which were in the process of defining their post-Cold War identity. Usually, we can refer this to the post-communist states, but not only. However strange it may seem, NATO is trying to define its identity. Russia has been debating its national identity for the last 200 years, and it caught up in endless arguments over whether Russians are Europeans or Eurasians. And this debate is still going on, but it took the form of a fierce ideological struggle between modernizers and conservative forces. This debate has nothing to do with geography, it has nothing to do with religion, it has nothing to do with culture. It's about a model for our post-communist development. And the criticism by Russian and foreign politicians, analysts and journalists of Putin's administration for rolling back democratic laws and institutions is fair in many aspects. However, in the context of a historic analysis, it is important to identify the clear reference points in this criticism. Russia started its post-communist evolution from scratch. It didn't have any impressive democratic past like most of the European countries. And even European countries in their history made big historical zigzags and retreats at times. Well, aside from these objective reasons, the West greatly underestimates the very negative attitude in Russia towards its experience in the 90s, including the role of the West played in events within and around Russia during those years. So I'm trying to say that Russia does not differ very much from the rest of Europe. It lags behind European countries in its evolution. And Russia could be reminiscent of Germany in the 20s, with its vibrancy and intense feeling of unfair treatment by others. France in the 40s, when it was trying to heal its traumas, or Italy in the 60s, as far as the nexus of power, money, and crime is concerned. Looking back in time, one cannot but recognize that Yeltsin's goal was to get rid of the Soviet legacy, of the Soviet past. Putin's goal, Putin's mission was to stabilize the country which was falling apart after Yeltsin's reform. Both achieved their goals with heavy losses to Russia's democratic evolution. Now, Medvedev's goal is to modernize the country, because the over-reliance on exports of raw materials creates obstacles not only to Russia's economic modernization, but also to Russia's integration with European Union. And the model of the economy based on exports of raw materials is a model of an authoritarian political system. This is the model of a system which implies growing stratification of society, and the all-permitting corruption of government, underemployment of the population, drain of intellectual capital and skilled human resources. This is also the model which, in the case of Russia, fits the policy of domineering in the post-Soviet space to ensure security, make transit pipelines cheaper, and gain control over the energy resources of other CIS countries. In the 90s, many people in the West naively believed that with the new generation of the Russian politicians, all problems would be resolved in a very natural way. I never believed in this optimistic scenario, because without radical changes in the system itself, it will be reproducing the same pattern, the same political forces. That is what we see now. Let me address, do I have time?
Yes.
You know, Russia has already reacted to the Western strategy with Medvedev's proposal to build a new security architecture in Europe. And this proposal should not be seen as an attempt to drive a wedge between Europeans and Americans, as a Soviet-like initiative from the old time. It is an appeal to the West to do the job we were supposed to do after the end of bipolarity. And in my view, it's very encouraging that some of the EU countries, including Cyprus, has already supported this proposal. But criticism of the opponents in the West is revolving around the substance of a new treaty. And they say that Medvedev's proposal established just general rules of behavior. In my view, a new treaty, and you know, Medvedev's proposal has already initiated a big academic debate in Russia. My institute is involved in this discussion. And in my view, a new treaty should address three fundamental contradictions of the post-bipolar era. First, nations' right for self-determination and territorial integrity. The Helsinki Act has given a clear priority to territorial integrity. So we should address this issue and understand whether territorial integrity is still more important than that nation's right for self-determination. And we should define clear conditions for self-determination. We should amend the international law. The second, in my view, territorial integrity is still much more important than nation's right for self-determination, particularly in the multipolar world. The second fundamental contradiction between nations' right for sovereignty and consequently non-interference of other states in their domestic affairs and nations' right for humanitarian intervention. It's a very important issue. In 1999, NATO and the United States used this principle to prevent humanitarian tragedy in Yugoslavia, but they did not even think that other nations could apply this right. And in the Caucasus crisis, Russia has applied to this right to prevent humanitarian tragedy in the Caucasus. And the The third is the contradiction between nations' right to freely choose security alliances and nations' right to oppose expansion of these alliances if they are perceived as a security threat. It's a very serious contradiction, and usually it is seen through the prism of needs enlargement. But in principle, we can refer this contradiction to CSTO. Just imagine that Serbia, all of a sudden, wants to join CSTO. How will the West react to CSTO expansion? It's a very important issue. Unfortunately, I don't have time to dwell on post-bipolar European institution, because a new treaty won't be viable without a new architecture. But it's a different issue. I say only that, in my view, since nobody is going to destroy the existing institutions, the solution can be found in redistribution of functions and missions between the existing institutions. But I don't have time to dwell on this issue, so I'm going to the worst scenario. It's the best scenario, in my view. If, of course, this ideal system won't appear overnight, but it's an ideal scenario in our relation. It's the best scenario if we address Medvedev's proposal seriously, and if we start discussion on these proposals, I think we could adjust the existing security architecture to our new post-bipolar needs. But it won't happen overnight, and the necessary precondition is to change the model of relations which exist today between Russia and the European Union. Well, the model of the Russia-West relations in the 90s was, in Russian eyes, unfair, but it was very simple. Russia accepted the Western lead. Now, the existing model is absurd, because it is based on two approaches which cannot be reconciled by definition, and each of these approaches contains deep internal contradiction. What does European Union want from Russia? First of all, it wants Russia to be a reliable energy supplier. That is priority number one. Then it wants Russia to be democratic and not to create problems in the post-Soviet space. But all these goals are incompatible. If Russia is only gas and oil for European Union, it will never become democratic, and it will continue to create problems in the post-Soviet space, as I have already described, protecting transit routes and so on. What does Russia want? Russia wants to be a modern economy based on the most advanced Western technology. It wants to remain a sovereign democracy, and it wants to maintain its sphere of special interests in the post-Soviet space. Again, all these goals are incompatible, because if Russia remains a sovereign democracy and if it continues to create problems in the post-Soviet space, it will never become a modern democracy without Western help. So we need to change this vicious, we need to get out of this vicious circle. Well, the West scenario is obvious. It's in a case of a new crisis, there will be a new confrontation, whatever its name, and in the multipolar world, other centers of power will use the Russia-West differences to their own advantage. China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and many others will take advantage from these differences. The world would be a mess would be real mess from my point of view. It will be the end of all non-proliferation activities with all the most terrible consequences. And if I would like to say a few words about Eastern Mediterranean. Between the worst and the best scenario, there is always room for the third option. And in my view, this scenario, or this model of the relations, has already developing within the last 15 years. It's neither partnership nor confrontation model. And or it can be called a selective cooperation when interests of the West and Russia coincide, and it is reduced to a kind of foot in the door policy when their interests diverge. And if we look at Eastern Mediterranean, this model is already developing. Since Eastern Mediterranean, together with the Black Sea, was a borderland between Russia and the West, and since NATO is still a military alliance which is expanding, it is expanding traditional perceptions, traditional security perceptions. I could mention only that with NATO's new bases in Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, our Admiral Massorin started to talk about Russia's naval presence in the Mediterranean region. And of course, Russia's of the lack of financial resources, Russia won't be able to reinstate the Soviet-like presence in Eastern Mediterranean, but it will create new tensions between the West and Russia, between the Russia and Israel, because one of the places for stop and support base is in Syria. As for Turkey, of course, aside from anti-American sentiments, there is a lot of common interests, energy and economic interests. But again, being dissatisfied at NATO and the United States for different reasons, Russia and Turkey have already manifested a tendency towards unilateral conduct. They oppose NATO's and United States efforts to expand anti-terrorist activities to the Black Sea area. And in my view, this model has one deficiency. It cannot last forever. You cannot balance between the West, Israel, Arab states. At the end of the day, you'll have to choose side, which means that this will lead us again to the West scenario, to a new confrontation. And I'm concluding, of course, my lecture was much longer, but I'm concluding my presentation with a quote from one Chinese philosopher. I like the Chinese philosophy very much. It is well known for its paradoxical wisdom. And one of the philosophers said, even standing still, one can make a lot of mistakes. So I think it is time to step out of the Cold War shadow. Thank you.